All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Esmacher, and today we are going to be talking about America and King Cotton. In your textbook, we've been talking about the Industrial Revolution and how it changed the North, especially with the growth of factories, with the use of mechanization. So today we're going to kind of take a step back and we're going to look at a place that's a little bit differently impacted by the Industrial Revolution. We're going to look at the role of cotton in the South. We're going to talk about how it's tied to the development of the Industrial Revolution in the North. And we're also going to talk about how this drastically changes slavery in the United States. All right, so first we need to kind of establish what is the South. So you could ask a bunch of different people, what is exactly the South? They'll probably give you different answers. But the American South is what you can see on this image in the red. So today we're going to be talking mostly about the Deep South. So states like Louisiana, Mississippi and Alabama, Georgia, Florida. So we're going to kind of be moving away from our focus on sort of the coastal South that we've been focusing on most of the semester, like Virginia and the Carolinas, and instead be moving our attention farther south and west. There are a lot of states in the South that kind of border other regions. So for example, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, which doesn't exist yet at the time that we're talking about today. West Virginia is created because of the Civil War. But even Maryland and Delaware, two states that most of us probably don't think about as Southern today, were technically part of the South. So those border regions are not going to be necessarily the focus of our discussion today. I'm going to talk about why that is when we talk about the economy. We're going to be focusing on the area where cotton is the most predominant. All right, why was cotton king in the South? Well, there's a couple of different reasons why cotton came to become the dominant cash crop in the American South. Remember, for most of the colonial period, the big cash crop of the South was tobacco, grown in especially like Virginia, Maryland, and then some rice in the Carolinas and coastal Georgia. But for the most part, tobacco was the big product, right? It was a pretty easy consumer product to sell because it's addictive, right? It's a species that's native to the Americas. But tobacco demands a lot of the soil. And so after more than 100 years, right? Because they start tobacco cultivation in the early 1600s. So by the time we get to the early 1800s, it's been 200 years of tobacco cultivation. The soil quality is declining. Therefore, it's more difficult to grow crops that are cash producing. And so this is partly why we have a search for sort of a new cash crop for the South, one that will grow better in challenging conditions, and also looking for new areas to move into in the South. So cotton as a material, as a fabric from the cotton plant, starts to become popular in the late 1700s, especially sort of printed cotton called calico patterns. And this was introduced from India, which at this time there were some British trading posts in India. This is before the British took over India as a colony. And cotton was a great alternate fabric. A lot of people were making homespun, which is very rough, or wearing wool, which was very heavy, and cotton was a sort of nice, light, breezy fabric, an alternative. But the problem with cotton from a growing standpoint is that it's very difficult to process. Maybe it's because I'm from Southeast Texas, but as a child, I remember going to local history museums and them having displays dedicated to cotton and giving you the opportunity to try to manually process cotton. After cotton's picked off the plant, and you can kind of see what it looks like here in this advertisement for King Cotton, you have to process it by picking out the seeds, which are kind of sticky, and it takes a lot of labor to process cotton by hand. And so that kind of cut into the production of cotton because it was very time consuming, not only to grow, but also to process. The processing of cotton got a lot easier when Eli Whitney, a Northern inventor, invented a machine called the cotton gin in 1793. The cotton gin basically mechanized the production of cotton after it was picked by laborers or slaves, mostly slaves in the South, and then made it so that the processing of cotton, getting the seeds out, getting the cotton ready to be shipped, increasingly after 1793 to textile factories located in the North, this made it a lot easier to process cotton. So kind of that stopgap in cotton production of getting cotton from the field to the factory, this starts to get a lot easier and a lot faster. And so what we end up happening is now that cotton can be processed easier and faster, now more people have incentives to grow cotton because there's a demand for cotton as factories spring up to weave thread and to take thread and turn it into cloth. And then we start to get also more towards the mid 1800s, ready-to-made clothing, which is kind of unusual at this time. There's a huge demand for cotton by these northern textile factories, and they can't get enough cotton to meet people's demands for this fabric. And so this gives an incentive to Southerners to start growing cotton to meet this market demand in the North. And the other thing that makes cotton possible to kind of take over the Southern economy is not only Northern demand, Northern factory demand for cotton as a raw material, and the cotton gin technology making it easier to process cotton, but also that there's more land available in the South to people to establish new farms and plantations. Particularly, there's more land in what we call the Deep South after 1812. Remember that Andrew Jackson signed this treaty with nations like the Creek and the Choctaw during the War of 1812, which gave access to far more land in that region. Even though it had been already technically American territory, it had been very heavily occupied by Native Americans who had been a barrier to white settlement. So now that there's this treaty where they end up ceding control of a lot of this land to the US government, now this land becomes more accessible to white settlers to move farther west, farther southwest, and to establish new large plantations to grow cotton. So you can see by looking at the maps on this slide just how far cotton shifts. So in 1820, when we're still kind of in the infancy of the cotton gin, you can see that major areas of cotton production are still kind of in what we will call sort of the Old South, the coastal regions like North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. You can actually see that the epicenter of cotton production, at least initially, is in Western South Carolina. However, once you go down to the bottom image, this shows you cotton production by 1860. You can see how the center has shifted to the southwest. The areas of intense cotton production here are in the red. So you can see, especially along the Mississippi River, right? You can see that. You can see a pocket in southeast Texas, where I am from. And you can see a lot of this cotton production shifting, right? Not as much anymore in the old coastal South that we've been focusing on for most of the semester up until this point. So part of the reason that cotton production shifts to the Southwest is, again, this availability of land that has increased after 1812. Excuse me, I haven't had enough coffee this morning. The better quality soil in these regions, right, that wasn't already exhausted by tobacco production. And this really, good morning, Brian. How you doing?
I'm good. It's taking a while to load up.
That's okay. We'll get there. So let me know when you see the PowerPoint, or if I need to share screen again to make it easier.
Okay, we're good. I'm finally up.
Finally up? Okay, awesome. So I was just talking about the increase in cotton production. So cotton becomes more desirable because it's a lighter fabric than wool or homespun cloth. Now we have northern factories increasingly because of the Industrial Revolution, right? Making thread and fabric. And as we get to the mid 1850s, or excuse me, mid 1800s, ready-made clothing becomes more popular. But cotton production has to shift to the Southwest because the soil is really exhausted by tobacco production kind of in the older South. And so we start to see cotton, as you can see here, the top image is 1820, the bottom is 1860. So you can see just how much cotton production is grown, right? Because there's much more areas on the map. And B, how much it's shifted. And can you see here along the Mississippi River? That's a really kind of intensive area.
Yeah.
Yeah. So cotton is in demand. Southerners are trying to meet the demand for cotton by northern factories, and they're finding this land to be much more suitable to cotton production. It's not exhausted by 200 years of tobacco cultivation, and this land is now available to them after treaties with Native Americans following the War of 1812. Any questions so far? Are we good?
Nope, we're good.
Awesome. All right. So the growth of cotton as a crop, and especially as a really desirable crop, leads to the growth of slavery. Just to give you an idea of how dominant cotton production becomes in the South, the South by 1860 produced 75% of the world's cotton. So not only are they sending it to northern factories, but they're also exporting it. And cotton actually accounts for 50% of all US exports before the Civil War. So this is big business. Cotton production is big business for the American economy. It's not just the Southern economy, the national economy. But cotton requires a lot of labor to grow and to process, despite the invention of the cotton gin making processing faster. So because of this, we see a growth of slavery. One of the things that I want to talk about is the Mason-Dixon line. Have you ever heard of that one?
Yes.
Yes. So the Mason-Dixon line was basically the boundary between the South and the North. So this boundary was drawn in the 1700s, and that basically represented the upper limit of the South. Okay, so like Maryland and Delaware, below that line, Washington, D.C. And there's a big growth in slave population about this time, partly because, number one, natural increase. Your textbook, right, talks about the fact that slaves that are brought to North America, the population tends to be more stable. They tend to live longer, therefore they have more kids than the slave population in places like Brazil, where they were mostly importing young men who died at a relatively young age because of hard labor. So the slave population in the United States is getting bigger, despite the fact that at this time, most northern states were ditching slavery. And by 1860, about 4 million slaves were in the United States. And depending upon the state, in the South, slaves made up somewhere between a third to half of Southern state populations. South Carolina had the biggest proportion. They actually had a slim majority of their state population was enslaved. So the South experienced an increase, as I mentioned, because of cotton. As cotton becomes in demand, they need labor to process this. So, okay, we understand why the South saw an increase in slave labor to feed the demand for cotton. But why did the North experience a decrease at the same time?
Because it was outlawed in most of the states by then, right? In the North?
Right. So most of the northern states, right, are moving to outlaw slavery, right? They're rolling it back either immediately or through gradual emancipation, right? Where they say, okay, you're enslaved up until this age and then you're free.
Yeah.
Why were they moving to outlaw? Did they just believe that slavery was wrong, or were there other reasons why they didn't need slavery anymore?
It's probably a combination of both moral, but both like there's not as many cotton fields, obviously in the South, so it was less labor. But there was
Yeah.
still, I'm sure there was still things slaves were forced to do.
Yeah, so in the northern states, you're right. There's like less of these large scale commercial farms producing a crop like cotton, right? That's a valuable export. Um, and also, as we move to factories, right, with the Industrial Revolution, it doesn't make sense if you're a factory owner to have slaves. It's far more cost effective and flexible a labor option to pay somebody by the hour, right? So as we see this shift towards wage labor in the North because of the industrialization, slavery just basically starts to die out already. So again, despite the fact that we're focusing mostly on the North, or excuse me, the South today, the North is still very heavily involved with slavery. Like we spend a lot of time when we talk about slavery saying, oh, the South was bad because they hold on to slavery for so long and they go to a war, right, to the Civil War, trying to defend the right to own slaves. But slavery couldn't have prospered in the South without Northern cooperation, right? The demand for cotton in Northern factories, Northern banks and companies invest in plantation in the South. In fact, by the time we get to the Civil War, there's more money invested in slaves in the South than in factories, railroads, and banks combined nationwide. So it's big business. And the North is just as involved in sustaining slavery as the South, although their involvement is obviously a little different. They're not directly enslaving people, but they are bankrolling things like improvements to plantations, etc. All right. So here you can see a growth of slavery in the South. So what's interesting is that the amount of slaves is fairly stable until we get past like 1810, 1820, and then it really skyrockets. And you can see that there is a correlation between slavery and cotton production. So the amount of slaves in the South really heavily increases along with the heavy increase in the production of cotton. So the South may have gone the way of the North in getting rid of slavery because it didn't make sense if they hadn't latched onto cotton as a production crop, right? So is looking kind of questionable, the long-term future of slavery about the time of the American Revolution, because again, lots of issues with soil quality due to overgrowth and overcultivation of tobacco. But now once they find cotton and once they have the invention of the cotton gin to make processing easier, it's going to drastically increase. So the South, unlike the North, is becoming more reliant on slavery. At the same time, the North is moving away from it. All right. Any questions on that?
Nope.
All right. So most of the growth in slavery, by the way, like this just shows the numbers of slaves in the South. Most of the growth in slavery is happening in what we call the Deep South. So Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Florida. That's where most of slavery is increasing. All right. So as cotton production starts to shift southwest, we're going to see slavery in the center of slavery shift southwest as well. And this is what scholars call the Second Middle Passage, because for about 200 years after the first introduction of slavery in the early 1600s, for the most part, slavery was kind of contained to the coastal South, so like Virginia, the Carolinas, areas of Georgia, and pretty stable in terms of slaves. Oftentimes, their families were there for generations on the same plantation. This starts to change as cotton production moves to the Southwest and demand for slaves also moves to the Southwest. There's also the fact that the United States moves to ban importation of slaves in 1808. So remember, the Constitution had that clause that slavery, like slave trade, couldn't be banned for a certain number of years after the creation of the Constitution. As soon as that deadline hits, Congress moves to go ahead and ban importing slaves. Now, that doesn't mean there was no more importation of slaves, because people always smuggled supplies in, the grand old American tradition of smuggling. but you couldn't really legally import slaves anymore after 1808. So as the demand for slaves increases, we can't import anymore. So that means you're going to be restricted to the slaves that are already here in the United States. So as the demand for slaves to grow cotton grows, and we also have, again, this shift, then you can see that we start seeing slaves being sold from places in kind of the coastal South into areas like the Mississippi River Valley. So you can see here, this is actually a map from 1860 showing where the slave population was the most concentrated. So the darker area, the bigger the concentration. So you can see a really heavy concentration along the Mississippi River Valley. And especially around kind of this area. This is why we call this the Cotton Belt. So slaves are being basically torn apart from their families. Again, there had been a fairly stable population before, and now they're being shipped off because as the slave trade is banned as well and cotton production increases the demand for slaves, what do you think the value of slaves does?
So that was a question I was going to have. Did the treatment of slaves was worse, obviously you're saying, but because of the commodity and the rarity, did it change, or did it make go more extreme?
The price of slaves definitely went up. Especially slaves that were considered kind of prime field hand labor, so younger men or women. So if you have really young slaves or really old slaves, they're not as desirable. So basically, like any kind of commodity in a capitalist economy, right? Supply and demand.
Right.
There's limited supply because you can't import anymore, but there's a high demand. So the price of slaves goes up. The kind of estimates and numbers sort of shift a little bit, but some folks have estimated that a prime slave during this period in the South probably would have set you back about at least 40,000 in today's dollars. So the price of slaves is going up because they're in demand and there's a limited supply. Like you said, the treatment of the slaves, you would think, right? If you have an investment that's significant, you think you would want to take care of it, right?
Right.
However, not necessarily the case for slaves. There were some owners that did kind of recognize that and try to take better care of their slaves. This is what we call a paternalism in the South, right? This notion that slave owners were the caretakers of their slaves. But remember, slaves are legally seen as property that you can do whatever the hell you want with. There's no laws to limit abuse or violence or mistreatment because they're your property. They're not seen as people by the legal system. And one of the more horrific side effects of the demand for more slaves, for slave women, is the fact that, okay, they need to start popping up more kids, right?
Yeah.
More slaves. And so we see an increase of assault of slave women by masters and overseers, et cetera, trying to breed more slaves. So, and in some areas, like, I don't know if your textbook mentions this specifically, in some areas like Louisiana, there's actually a demand for lighter skinned women by these slave owners to kind of have as their personal mistresses. They're called like fancy girls. And so there's this, again, kind of incentive to further assault and assault these slave women by white men to kind of get this lighter skin, lighter complexion over time, which is very deeply sad. I actually put up on Blackboard for your class a documentary, an episode of Many Rivers to Cross. This is a documentary about the African American experience, and the episode I put up talks about slavery during this time. And it specifically focuses on the slave experience during the Second Middle Passage. And it does a far better job of talking about this than I could. So that's why I put it up on Blackboard.
Okay.
All right. Any questions?
Nope, all good.
All right, awesome. So the explosion of cotton in the South creates this very sort of elite class of planters. And when I say elite, I do mean elite. There's not very many people that would classify as a planter. In order to be considered a planter, you had to own more than 20 slaves. And again, as we mentioned, because slaves are really expensive, that's a pretty significant investment. So you had to have money. So only about 40,000 families in the South would have met this criterion. And of the people that had more than 20 slaves, an even smaller number had more than 100 slaves. Only about 2,000 people had these very large plantations with a large number of slaves. So these guys are really kind of the very small elite of the South. Their influence is kind of interesting, despite the fact that they are a small population within the South. I mean, think about depictions of this time period in the South in media. We tend to focus, right, on the big plantations, right? Kind of think about like the movie Gone with the Wind, right? This sort of culture of sort of extravagance and wealth. And part of the reason that we focus on them, even though they're not the majority in the South, is because they represent kind of the ideal of Southern success, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Their influence is outsized because of their numbers, because they represent the people in the South who've made it economically. The wealthiest of the wealthy plantation owners were clustered in South Carolina, where they're mostly still sticking to rice production. And rice production requires, again, a lot of labor. And so rice plantations are among sort of the most expensive of the different plantation styles, because rice is very difficult to grow. And then the other kind of cluster of wealthy plantation owners is in Mississippi. Again, kind of due to cotton. And then we also see sugar plantations in the lower part of the Mississippi River Valley. So the planter class is successful in part because they occupied the best land. So a lot of the planters in the Deep South by the time of the Civil War had either come over themselves or were the descendants of those who had come over from kind of more the coastal South, and were among the first to kind of get there and pick the prime land. So because they have good quality land, they're reaping the benefits agriculturally, getting bigger and better crops. Plantation owners run their plantations like businesses, because they are businesses. They are focused on maximizing profit, and frequently invest their profits into adding more land and more slaves. The value of slaves, again, kind of increases. So yeah, that 40,000 number was right. Now I see it in my notes. So that meant that the average citizen, it's harder for them to own slaves because it's very expensive to buy them. So again, that kind of prices out a lot of average Southerners from aspirations of establishing their own plantation, because it requires a lot of money to acquire land and to acquire slaves. Plantation owners also keep tabs on the market conditions worldwide, the demand for cotton. They monitor production costs. So we tend to think, in popular media at least, like Southern plantation owners are oftentimes depicted as sort of unplugged from the day-to-day operations of the plantation, right? They're focused on leisure. That's not the case. They're very plugged into this. They see this as their business, their investment. Now, they certainly do invest in leisure and nice things. Wealthy plantation owners really focus on flaunting their wealth through what we call conspicuous consumption. So in other words, you broadcast your wealth by the clothes that you wear, or the antiques that you have in your house, the elaborate houses that you build, or taking lots of vacations, or throwing lots of parties. So in other words, demonstrating the wealth you have through either stuff or activities that the masses can't afford. So kind of the antebellum equivalent of like rappers talking about how much they love like Gucci and Louis Vuitton, etc. So any questions about that? Very small population, but outsized influence.
Yeah, all good.
All right, awesome. Now, the vast majority of people in the South are not planters. They are not fabulously wealthy. Most of the population in the South, what kind of scholars dub plain folk. These are people that are not nearly as successful as the plantation owners, partly because a lot of these folks occupy land that we would call marginal. In other words, land that isn't really good quality or isn't suited to growing crops large scale, especially like think of people like in kind of hill country or mountain ranges like the Appalachian Mountains. So they really don't have a lot of land to cultivate. So because of this, because these guys tend to be poor, they tend to occupy land that isn't conducive to this large scale business model. About 75% of this part of the South does not own slaves. They just don't have the money to be able to own slaves. And for the 25% of the non-planter folk that do own slaves, they are not likely to own very many, maybe one or two. Most of these folks are getting by on subsistence farming. So in other words, they're not growing these cash crops to sell to market. They're literally growing food to survive, to feed themselves. Because of this, and because of, again, kind of them being poor and not affording slaves, this means the whole family working on the farm for the family to survive and feed themselves. Many of these folks are more isolated. They're not as plugged in to transportation systems like rivers or the new railroads that we see in the Industrial Revolution. So even if they did produce excess crops, they're not as able to get them to market to sell. So most of them, again, are farming to kind of sustain themselves. And most of them are still, by the time we get to the Civil War, again, because they're isolated, kind of making their own goods. They're not consuming manufactured products. Like they're not buying, for example, cotton made in textile factories. They're still probably making their own fabric and clothes at home. Now, their relationship to the planter class is really interesting. Some of them really resent the planter class because they see them as hogging all of the good land, all of the wealth, hogging all the political power in the South. And many politicians actually kind of run on that, right? They're like, oh, those rich elitists, right? They try to appeal to the masses. But there is one thing that unites them together, and that is race. Even though these guys are poor, kind of what we would consider sort of like the equivalent of like white trash, they are still white, which means they are not what?
They're not black.
They're not black. They're not slaves, right? They are legally people. Even if they're very poor people with not a lot of power, they're still people. And so because of this, even though there is some resentment of the planters, for the most part, the planters and politicians kind of emphasize that shared whiteness and that shared Southern identity as opposed to Northerners, right? The culture is very different. One of the last sources in history assignments that you're actually going to do talks about the cultural differences between Southern and Northern politicians and how violent Congress gets before the Civil War. All right. So as slavery expands in the South, but is shrinking in the North, slavery becomes a topic of discussion, especially in Congress. Slavery is written into the Constitution, right? It's not mentioned by name, but we have things like the 3/5 clause, right, where 3/5 of the slave population is counted for representation in Congress, stuff like that. So many of the founding fathers saw slavery as a necessary evil, but they also saw it as a system that was dying, that was on its way out. And so they felt that, okay, yes, we're including it in the Constitution, so the South signs on, but it's not going to be around that much longer because they didn't see this twist that cotton came onto the scene and provided. So in the South, though, by the time we get to the eve of the Civil War, they don't see slavery as a necessary evil. They don't see it as something that is bad, but is necessary for their economy. They see it more as an essential component of Southern culture and Southern freedom. which is kind of funny. They sort of see slavery as a right, like the right to own slaves. They see that as essential to Southern culture, in part because slavery and slave labor is so important to the Southern economy. And so, interestingly, the existence of slavery in the South is what really guarantees freedom to Southern white people. Are you following their logic?
Yep.
All right, so because of that, and because of your growing abolitionist movement in the North, which you guys are going to start reading about next week, there are a lot of Southerners who feel the need to defend slavery. And so the arguments in favor of slavery kind of follow three tracks. The first one is slavery establishes white supremacy. So the idea is that Africans could be enslaved or should be enslaved because they were uncivilized, that white people were more evolved, and that slavery was actually for the benefit of Africans because it allowed white people to tame them and to civilize them. Okay, so that's one argument, right? That white people are better. Another argument is pointing to the existence of slavery both throughout history and even in the Bible. And it's true, there's a very long tradition of slavery in world history. There are passages in the Bible that discuss slavery and servants, but the American version of slavery was very different than other kinds of slavery. And what's interesting, and I think you guys have, this is what, week 6? 5, 6, 6. I believe this is one of the essay options for this week, to talk about how an abolitionist and how a slavery apologist both use the Bible to either defend slavery or to argue against slavery. So that's kind of interesting. There's also this argument that the existence of slavery ensures class equality among white people in the South. In other words, Southerners are looking to the North, where industrialization is creating this very large, poor working class, and then a very kind of small elite sort of capitalists or industrialists. And they're like, look, slavery means that white people don't have to work these like dirty, low-paying jobs like they do in the North because we just have slaves do that. And so they're arguing that there's a little bit more equality among white people in the South than there is in the North because the slaves do all of this kind of menial labor. So these are some of the arguments that Southerners are floating about slavery at this time. The other reason, other than the growing abolitionist movement and slavery disappearing in the North, that Southerners are getting more defensive about slavery is because slavery is rapidly disappearing in the world. Part of this is a wave of revolutions in Latin America between 1810 and 1830, in which colonies of Portugal and Spain are rising up and declaring independence. A lot of these new nations, new republics in Latin America declare either slavery to be completely abolished, or they go the route of some northern states and say gradual abolition. But for the most part, these nations are ditching the institution of slavery. And we're the ones that did embrace gradual abolition set a really young age for those slaves to be freed. The other thing, so we have lots of new nations ditching the institution of slavery, and then the other thing is the British also ditched slavery. Abolition is introduced in Parliament in 1833, and by 1838, there's no more legal slavery, not only at home in Britain, but throughout the entire British Empire. And abolition by the British actually introduced the notion that, okay, we're going to get rid of slavery, but we'll compensate slave owners for the loss of their property. So what this means is by 1850, there are very few places outside of the United States that still have slavery. Cuba and Puerto Rico were still Spanish territories. They still allow slavery. Brazil is still under control of the Portuguese. They allow slavery still. And then there's the United States, and that's it. So you can actually see in this chart here the areas when they abolished slavery by the colors. So you can see Brazil actually hangs in there until 1888, so even longer than the United States does. But so the Southerners are feeling increasingly boxed in, like they feel like their sort of way of life of using slave labor is under attack. And Americans argued that all these new Latin American nations rejecting slavery and how unstable some of these societies were following revolution kind of proved their point that if we abolished slavery, that it would be very difficult, that there would be social unrest, that our economy would be completely wrecked, because now we would have to actually pay workers, and that would cut into profit margins. And so they're arguing that this is just something that we shouldn't do. The example that probably strikes the most fear into the heart of slave owners in the South is the Haitian Revolution, which is actually the first successful slave rebellion in world history that establishes the independent nation of Haiti. And so a lot of Southerners were like looking at the example of Haiti is kind of their sort of worst fear, that slaves would realize their advantage in numbers, that they would rise up against their white masters and also like kill a bunch of them. Your textbook mentions like Nat Turner in 1831, I believe, and his rebellion, also kind of getting slaves to rise up and rebel against white people, and kills a bunch of white people. So there's always this fear of violence and rebellion. And so this also kind of feeds into why they treat slaves so harshly, because there's this fear that they will revolt and will start killing white people. But again, kind of slave rebellions are fairly rare because Southern states start to establish laws to make it difficult, like they don't allow African Americans to gather without white supervision, or they require that African Americans attend white churches and not their own churches. They forbid slaves to be taught reading and writing. So there are all kinds of laws that Southern states try to enact to limit the ability of slaves to stage successful large-scale rebellions. So to kind of wrap up for today, one of the reasons I like to kind of talk about the culture in the South, that this is going to start to lay the groundwork for the Civil War. What's interesting is that the view of our nation's founding documents, like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, starts to be interpreted differently in the South than in the North. Southerners actually argued that the phrase "all men are created equal" was a mistake, that it was simply not true, that white people were better than everybody else, and therefore, no, not all men were equal. Southerners also interpreted freedom as a privilege and not a right. So in other words, like when we talk about rights, we mean something that we're entitled to, right? So for Southerners, something like, for example, voting. Many Southern states were really hesitant to change voting laws to allow people with less land or paying less in taxes to vote, because they still viewed voting as a privilege that you got if you belong to a certain social class, rather than a right that you should have as a free citizen of the United States. So for them, kind of freedom is a sign of status. So if you were white, you were free, that was a badge of status. Freedom wasn't exactly a right. There's lots of belief in social hierarchy, much like we kind of saw the Puritans say, right, that social classes were a good thing, that naturally some people would be rich and some would be poor. Southerners kind of argue the same thing. They're like, oh, well, it's perfectly natural for society to have like a few people who have it all and a lot of people who don't. That's part of life. That's part of human existence. And we also start to see Southerners interpret attacks on slavery, especially from abolitionists, as a tax on them and their freedom. And that attempts to regulate or restrict or end slavery was actually an attempt not only to restrict their freedoms, but to enslave them, which is kind of hyperbolic, but that's what they argued. All right.